flood being universal. So we don't have this concept in the Quran. Okay, we believe in Prophet Noah as a prophet who was sent to his people, and that there was a flood that took place, but the flood does not indicate that it was worldwide. It says that he was sent to his people, and his people were flooded and they were destroyed. This also is not a problem. And in terms of the earth existing and the human beings inhabiting it, there is mention that the earth has existed previously, then the human beings came afterwards, which is in concordance. It works with science, with basically the model that the scientists present in that term. So, but like I said before, is that the Quran is not a book of science necessarily. As one scholar says, it's not a book of science, it's a book of science. Not S-C-I-E-N-C-E, but science, right? Instead, that's what it is. So it's not going to give you all these specific details. Okay, so part of the reason why we don't have the problem is because it didn't mention all these details. Okay, which we believe obviously was done deliberately. And the second part is that the details that it does mention about science happen to be in perfect accordance with what's established in science. In fact, there's many scientific things mentioned about the world in the Quran that were mentioned in there. For example, the stages of the development of the human embryo within the mother's womb. Nobody before they had the microscopes could have figured out the stages that is mentioned. The stages are mentioned in the Quran, and they happen to correlate exactly with what modern science says. But that's just a brief answer to.
Yeah.
My question was, usually sometimes people say that pesticide is actually showing that there is a gradual adaptation, or I guess survival of the fittest kind of method. So what do you say about that issue? Where basically, some die and...
Yeah, the question is about antibiotic resistance. You said?
Or like DDT?
Yeah, like DDT, right. So we say antibiotic resistance to DDT, for example, is presented as evidence. Basically, there's two things. First of all, even if it could be shown, like I said, it's not sufficient to really tell you much. So even if it could be shown, it just shows you that there's something going on. But like Darwin said in this quote, right? Grounded entirely on general consideration. So when you descend to the details, you still can't prove that any species changed. You can't prove anything still, even if you were able to prove that. But the second thing is that even in terms of the DDT antibiotic resistance, in fact, there were tests that were performed by a Jewish professor in one of the universities in occupied Palestine, Israel, whatever you want to call it, and his test basically showed that the mutation that was taking place, or the change that was actually taking place, it was actually negative, but it resulted in a positive effect the way that we observe it. So it's not necessarily a beneficial effect that's taking place, but instead what's happening is, like he gave the example. He said, look, if you take a key and you put it in the door, the key is supposed to go in the door. Now if you deform the key, if you mess the key up, it's not going to fit in the door anymore. Technically, you haven't done something positive. It has not caused a positive effect. But because that key's not able to fit in the door anymore, no one can get in now. We perceive it to be a positive effect. So that's the answer to that.
Maybe elaborate on the creationist view of microevolution and where you draw the line between microevolution and macroevolution in the creationist aspect?
When you say creationist, you mean like the young earth creationist, or just general the creation paradigm that we're presenting?
General creation.
The general paradigm. So what is the line basically? Yeah. So this is the main difference right here, is that there's a tree of life in evolution and there's a forest of life, basically, in the creation paradigm. So they're saying that there is evolution within a species, and that's considered microevolution, but it stays within the kind. Some people say species, but it's within the kind that takes place. So that's basically, the range that you have. Does that answer your question? Okay. But they call it the creationist forest. They call it the evolutionary tree of life. So kind of fits into it.
I just said one question per person, and so we get to everyone. So I think if you already asked a question, you can ask that one too. Or if there's any question, we'll take that one first.
You mentioned the lack of transitional fossils. I see you have a computer there, and I saw on your website there was a Google bar. Now, if you type transitional fossils into there and hit enter, you'll see about 100,000 results on scientifically documented, university-funded, verifiable fossil evidence of transitional fossils, one of which goes on for pages and pages and pages. How can you stand there and say there are no transitional fossils when in almost every biology department in the entire country and around the world disagrees with you?
That's a good question. And the answer actually is because, like I said before, is that this model is being propagated. Okay, this model is being propagated by all the biology departments. So if you actually go and ask, and you say it's being propagated, you're saying that there's transitional forms all over the place. In reality, maybe if you do a Google search, maybe you're right, you can find that. But I definitely disagree with you. If you go to several universities around the world and you speak with several biologists on the subject, or several scientists on the subject, you would find that many of them would say that we've basically given up trying to find these transitional forms because all we're finding is the same things that we found before, and they're not conclusive evidence, and they actually don't serve as much evidence at all. So for example, you have the coelacanth, and then if you check now, just in 2006, they came up with another one, which is exactly like the coelacanth almost, and they're saying that, it also had, it had the fins, it had the ability to walk, and they start analyzing its fossil. It's called the Titanic, or whatever it's called. I don't know. Are you familiar with what it's called? No. Okay, but what I'm saying is it's going to happen again. It's been happening, and that's why I gave you all these examples. And the same thing's happening, is that what they're doing is they're doing the same thing that they've done before. They're just doing these minor analysis. They're just making these analyzations, and they're presenting them as transitional forms. Just because the science department is going to accept it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accepted by all the professors within that science department. And like I showed you before, is that there's a severe discrimination going on. So if you're going to reject that, then what happens? You're not going to be admitted in the science department. You're not going to be admitted in the paleontology department. So that's precisely what happens. And I ask you yourself, if maybe you can find a bunch on Google, right? If you search for anything, you can find a ton of stuff on Google. That's the whole point of Google, right? But go around to several universities around the world and go and ask the professors who are experts in the field. Go and ask professors who are experts in the field and ask them for a commentary on each transitional form that you claim to be a transitional form, and you see what you get. Professors are talking about this thing on bird evolution, for example. Professors from around the country, they say, I'm so embarrassed when I'm forced to get up and stand up and have to explain this because I don't believe it. This is absolute garbage. But you know what? You're going to lose your job if you don't do it, because the order comes from the top. Because now you're working in a system. You're just a worker in a factory. So we need to get beyond this. Like I said, be a rebel with the cause, and you need to go beyond